أهلا وسهلا بالجميع. My name is Lara Shiha. Welcome to Psychic Militancy. Before we dive into this episode, which I'm so excited about, and you're going to figure out why I'm so excited about this, please make sure you subscribe to our channel, follow, sign up for our Patreon, send this to a comrade. Like one of the things that I learned being on YouTube, which I did not know before, and now I take it very seriously, is YouTube suppresses all the shit. We knew that part. But the part that I didn't know is that it actually makes a difference to do the likes, to comment, to send to a comrade, to interact with it. Please do that so that we can keep making this content. But that's going to be on the side because you all know the drill. I am so excited to have Dr. CBS with us here, Charisse Burden-Stelly. As you all know, one of the things I love to do in these long form interviews is sort of invite folks that I learn so much from. And that as I think through the concept of psychic militancy and I grow into it and I sort of expand my thinking about it more, I've sort of been tracking folks that land for me as people who feel on my end like they do this naturally. Dr. CBS is one of those people. And so I reached out to her to join me, and I'm really, really, really excited that she's here. And I know that you all will too. She's got I don't feel like I have to introduce her to you. She's got a huge following. I feel like she's on my timeline constantly, which makes my timeline better. Like there are people who make your timeline shitty, and then there are people like Dr. CBS that pops up and I get really happy. So welcome to the show. Thank you so much for making time to sit down with me.
Of course. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so happy to be here.
So I start off these long form interviews with having folks locate themselves, introduce themselves. There are all these ways in which I know you in my world. You and I have actually not had the opportunity to meet in real time, so I'm excited for that. One day that will come. But I know you through comrades. I know you through your incredible work. We've interacted, of course, online. So there are ways that I feel like you fit into my world, but I always invite folks to locate themselves, introduce themselves. Like what feels salient for you right now if you were to introduce the audience, especially those who might not know you, to yourself?
Sure. I hate the memoir industrial complex. And so I always keep this type of stuff kind of like a intellectual political biography, I guess. But I'm an associate professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University, which is in Detroit, Michigan. I've written two books. My single author book is Black Scare, Red Scare, Theorizing Capitalist Racism in the United States. My co-author book with Gerald Horn, who is also on my shirt, is W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History. And then I'm also the co-editor of Organized Fight When, Black Communist Women's Political Writing, and of Reproducing Domination on the Caribbean Postcolonial State. Broadly, I work on what I call the tradition of radical Blackness, primarily in the 20th century, some 21st century. And I look at the intersections of anti-Black racial oppression and anti-radicalism, both from sort of the state level, but then also how do we resist that? I'm from Tucson, Arizona, which is random. I did my undergraduate at Arizona State and my graduate work at the University of California at Berkeley in African Diaspora Studies. I am a member of the Black Alliance for Peace, of Community Movement Builders, and of the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective. So that's a little bit about me. I don't know if you want me to say more.
That's awesome. I mean, it locates you. And I think the questions that I have for you might be able to take us into certain places. And I respect, by the way, that you're just like, I'm not for this, give your own personal history, industrial complex and have that be the thing.
Yeah. People are so nosy. And I just feel so uncomfortable, when people come and dump their whole purse out and I'm just like, oh my God. Well, it's like I'm burning all my journals when I die. It's like you have to figure out who I am by word of mouth.
And part of it is like, what of the times when we're like, the work that we do is actually not separate from who we are, right? Yeah. So this idea of like, I need to look behind always has this feel like somehow what we're doing academically is not actually us. Yeah. So there's that piece of it too. So I respect that because for me, I'm just like, you probably find the same shit. Like you're just gonna know me from from my work and what I
Exactly.
put forward.
Precisely.
I appreciate that. You're in good company. And even though you're on the show of a shrink, I'm not gonna like dig into this and I'm not gonna be like, what's behind this shit? That's the stuff
Right,
I
right.
stay away from.
If you're offering services, man, I probably need some therapy now.
We got some good comrades that we could line up. We got some good comrades. Well, you jumped right in for me. So just so folks, if you have not read Black Scare, Red Scare, folks, pick this up. Fucking awesome. Meticulous, just goes through, I think, locating the current moment, but then also the ways in which the project, the racist settler colonial project of the United States has been a continuous process. Make sure you pick that up. We're going to talk about a little bit about it today. But so as I had said before, you're someone that stands out to me in your practice of what I see as psychic militancy. Like when I see you speak, and when I listen to your work, certainly when I read your work, I think immediately you are somebody who has found a way, your own way, to remain rooted and sort of clear on the political facts and material facts of the world, and that it finds its way into your work and into your public facing approach to the world and to your work. Can you speak to the things in your world, your life, your upbringing, anything that feels relevant to you that has assisted you in having this clarity? And here I'm definitely thinking about your book, which, as I said, feels unbending and meticulous in how it lays out the foundations of the racial and fascist state we have at our hands. And you know me enough to know I'm not thinking about this just as a function of Trump, but a long-term political project of this racist settler colony. So I guess, both in terms of your own clarity and then collating it into a book like this, like what are the factors that brought that all together?
Yeah, it's so funny. Well, here's a tidbit of personal information. Like growing up, people would always say that I was crazy. Like I would just say anything, which is true, but I was just like, why wouldn't you just say, like, why wouldn't you just say what's on your mind? And another thing related to that is that, I have a little bit of an outward facing profile. And so when I meet people, they'll say something like, oh, you're exactly how you are online. And it's like, yeah, why wouldn't I be? I guess I hate the whole brand situation. It's like, I don't have a brand. I have a personality. I am a human being. And, the social media shit, that's baby town frolics. I'm doing it on my time off. You know what I mean? And so that has always been the case for me. Like I've just always kind of said what was on my mind and followed the things that interest me most. And when I went into academia, I made a pact with myself that I would get as far as I would get in academia being myself. And that has worked out relatively well. I feel like I've lost out on a lot because of that, but I've also been able to kind of do what I want to do, which is another question I get a lot, like, how are you in academia and you're so radical? And I'm like, I don't know. I publish it and hopefully, you can
That's exactly right.
Radar. Yeah. It's like jump through the hoops, but just do it in a way that is responsible to movement and to the people like, you're accountable to, and with the things that are important to you. And I feel like maybe that's a formula. I don't know. But I will say, and I also think that studies, so I didn't come from like a movement family or anything. I would say, my sister and I have a sister that I grew up with. We always had a sort of political sense of the world, but we were not from like a movement family or anything. But, I came to consciousness, as it were, or, was radicalized or politicized through study. And I started out as a hotep. Sometimes I still think I'm a hotep Marxist. So there's like a meme of Karl Marx with like a kufi on, and I'm like, yeah, that's pretty much me, So that was my starting point, and I still have a lot of affinity for like aspects of Afrocentricity. It was sort of how I came to consciousness as a young person, and then moved through various sort of modalities and am currently what I would call a Rodneyist or a, Black Marxist Leninist, I guess. So study is one thing. The second thing is like mentorship. I've been fortunate to be surrounded by very brilliant, politically oriented, and patient people. I'm not the easiest person. I have my own ideas, my own mind. I could be quite obstinate, but at every stage of my political and intellectual development, there has been people who have saw something in me that they were willing to work with and work alongside and cultivate and drag sometimes, criticize in ways that I could be receptive to. And so, these are people like I mentioned, Gerald Horn, my dissertation advisor, Percy Henson, Eula Taylor, Bra Baransby, but then also like some lateral peers. I think about, of course, my best friend, Layla Brown, Derica Purnell, JT Roan. There's just so many, Sandy Placido. There's just a lot of people that I can think about and name who have been integral to sort of shaping who I am intellectually and politically, but also like as a human being. Because some of the people that I admire most, they might not have the most radical politics, but they are kind people. And it's interesting, the people that I kind of admire or look up to the most, I'm like, God, you're so nice and kind. Like Robin Kelly, he is so kind. And I really admire that in people because I have to try, like my set point is sometimes not very nice. And so I really prioritize that because I think it is foundational to being any type of organizer, leader, servant. You have to like love people and be kind. So there's that. And then Black Alliance for Peace is the organization that I was most politicized in. I was basically an academic prior to like 2020. 2020, I joined Black Alliance for Peace, and that pretty much oriented my how I engage the work, the type of questions that I ask, the way that I write, the things that I value. And so that's been really formative. And then, of course, community, and that includes friends and comrades. I never realized how important, I didn't realize how important and I guess relatively rare friendship is until the advent of AI and the fact that people have chatbots as their main companions. That is so sad to me because I was like, don't people have friends? But a lot of people don't. And comrades, right? And so building community and participating in community. And then finally, I'll just say, I guess related back to the first point about me being crazy is that I've just always thought it was important to have courage in situations, all kinds of situations. And I, from the perspective of academia, I've never been a wait till I get tenure person. I've been the exact same from my first day of work until now, because I feel like courage is a muscle. And if you're a coward up until you get tenure, you're probably going to continue to be a coward. You're not just going to magically stand up for things because you have, whatever credentials. So I think all of those things have contributed to like what you adeptly name as psychic militancy, which I found very valuable and, helping me to be as aligned and principled as possible when it's not always easy and certainly not profitable to be that way,
I so appreciate that. And I appreciate that because there's so many moving pieces. Like it's not just one thing. It's a myriad of things that come together and are in relation and conversation with each other. But there are a couple things that really stood out to me. One, being in relation with people. Like that's the thing. I think a lot of folks are like, well, are people just born like psychically militant? Are they born militant? And I'm like, I mean, to your point, I think this is one thing you and I might share, and we didn't know that before, but like from there's like a temperament or an orientation to the world about seeing an injustice and sort of speaking about it. And for me, it was always, I couldn't go to sleep at night and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't say something. What's interesting is you're looking like a normative social world order does see that as crazy, right? The conformity aspect of of politesse particularly, and that's part of what I talk about with psychic intrusions. Like most of the psychic intrusions that I talked, especially to organizers about, were how they felt the social world disciplined them and the compromises they end up making politically because they felt disciplined by the world and wanted to like be good. Now we can add all the ways in which different social locations amplify that discipline in particular ways, gender, race, class, all these elements. But in the end, you know, anything that's not in alignment, full alignment and submission with normativity is going to be seen as crazy, right? And so there's also like a tolerance, number one, to not be liked. Number two is to feel like I can field that projection of crazy when like you and I both know, like what the fuck is more crazy than a world that kills Black people constantly, creates the conditions for a genocide, doesn't have enough houses for people when there are billionaires. Like I'm over here looking like I'm the one who's fucking crazy when you're all like, you're good with these conditions. That shit's not crazy to you, right? So I'm hearing all of that. The last thing I'll say is this. I love what you said about academia, because I think you and I both know that it could perhaps have not gone the way it has for you. And I think that's one of the things is like knowing that that is never a given that it goes this way. But I think one of the things that I realized after I was in academia was that people preemptively caved to the hypothetical condition that they were going to be disciplined before it even happened. I'm just like, why are you giving up your politics prior to that? Like, go full force. I'm somebody who was punished for that. I wouldn't do it differently. There's nothing that I could, you know, live with myself if I didn't do it that way. And like, but there's so many people that would give that up beforehand. And maybe this is the part that you're talking about, the courage piece, you know?
Yeah. And recognition and representation are so appealing because they perform a type of safety or relative stability. And so I'm sympathetic to a lot of politics I myself don't hold, because especially as a racialized person, a colonized person, I understand this sort of desire for safety, stability, and belonging. I understand that. But to the point that you just made, it's like, what does it mean to not be sort of maladjusted in this world? And what does it mean to actually want to belong to like a place like this? So it's, it is the part about like being comfortable with not being liked. I think that's even more difficult in this landscape because of things like social media, where as human beings, I don't think we are equipped psychologically to be bombarded with things like trolling and people, like the amount of people who don't like you because you're so connected and exposed to people from everywhere, right? And so it's again that type of thing. It does take a sort of fortitude and a steadfastness in like what you believe, and kind of knowing that you're right, or at least more right than the things that we're propagandized to believe that we are,
Yes. And for me, that's what it means to have a bigger cause than you, right? And that's, I think, the political commitments for me come first, because that will always, I might go through 1,000,001 ways that I doubt myself, criticize myself, rightfully so, try to push myself in certain directions. But the cause will remain the same. And that for me, in the moments of doubt, if I have a cause I'm committed to, that shit's always going to be my light. I'm going to be like, I'm checking. That's my touchstone,
Yeah.
Yeah. So this might be a good segue. So, and it's sort of, I want to segue into the other question I have for you, but I imagine there are many people in your world, in your life, maybe even in academia, who are like, don't study communism. Don't, put yourself out there and be like, full force, I'm a commie. This is where I stand on things. Like, but you did. And that's the follow-up question is the reclaiming. I feel that that's a part of it. We can get into that. But I wanted to touch base with you about that,
Mm-hmm.
about times you've heard that and like what your response is.
You know, what's funny about that, it's not only, I remember at a book workshop, you know, I write about, I'm a tanky, as they call it, right? So I write about like the Stalinists. And so it's not only to not write about communists, it's sort of like to not especially write about those communists, right? It's like Trotskyism is a little bit okay. Anarchism is a little bit okay. It's a little bit more accepted for a number of reasons. Social, you know, social democrat, whatever. But especially writing about like the CP, the Stalinists is especially frowned upon. But it made sense to me. I felt like I couldn't not write about the people from who I had learned so much. And to the extent that people learn from me, it's like you're learning from those people. Those people matter. Like they have the best, in my perspective, the best understanding of imperialism and fascism and capitalism and racial oppression. And so it made sense to me to use their ideas that are subjected to like intellectual McCarthyism. It made sense to me to lift up those ideas because it challenges who we consider to be knowledge producers, you know, what we consider to be knowledge production, where do we look? So something that, you know, I've said previously is like there's all of this discourse or like writing about like silence is in the archive, but this is a silenced archive. It's all there. There's so much stuff at the Tenement, at the Schomburg, you know, at Emory, at the Ruther. There's so much stuff everywhere, but people would rather sort of theorize off of one or two documents to make whatever claims they want to make rather than really engage with material that's there for a number of reasons. And so I think, and because I'm not the first person to do this, like, I don't even know that my work is super 100% original. I don't know that there's any new original work at this point, but it's also like, you know, people like Gerald Horne and Robin Kelly and Robbie Lieberman and a whole bunch of other people did this work before me. So I also have a responsibility to them to continue on in that way. And because I think it's good and interesting work. And, you know, you can write about these people in a way that is rigorous and that makes a contribution. So I didn't see the problem.
I love that. I mean, it's back to the point you were making before, is that you were connected to this for all the reasons you just said, and despite the seductions around you, and really the making of the worst type of specter. I mean, and that's the thing you're talking about, right? Is the manufacturing of the worst type is the shit you need to stay away from. And there's a way in which you're saying, listen, this might have been a gamble, but this was the thing that I felt aligned with. This was the thing that I was connected to. I went through and did that. And we see, and you're right, I do think that we miss out on opportunities, but that, like, you're doing well, sis. Like, this is, you know, you're out there with a book that like this. I think it's important.
But it's a book. So it is a book that was nominated for a lot of awards and did not win any. Mm-hmm. And that's okay, right? These are the type of things that I have to be okay with. It's like, I'm not going to be an Ivy League professor. I'm not going to, the books that I write are probably not going to win awards. Whether or not they deserve them is another thing. And so that's the nature of the beast. And it is hard, right? Like, as much as we want to discipline out the petty bourgeois and the liberal in us, like, there is, you know, you want the things that you work hard on and that you care about to be recognized for that, right? And so but I also have to remember at the same time, like, having been on some of these committees, this stuff is like, you know, there's whatever. So,
yes,
you know.
Yes. Yeah. We keep that tension, but you're right. Mm-hmm. And I think, I mean, for me, again, your work is a really great example of this, is that if the books are not winning awards, irrespective of their merit, mm-hmm. we can also look and say the entire system has an infrastructure that's stacked against this type of, like, this knowledge can go only so far within the academic setting, and that is a structure that's built on that like gets to the point of what I feel like you lay out for us. Like there's a reason that maybe you can have, like, there's a way in which the system will expand only so far. It's not going to go the entire way.
Right. Exactly.
You know. Well, so here, this might be a good segue into this question. So one of the things I appreciated about your book, as I've told you, was how you resist locating a Red Scare as happening in one moment only, right? Most people think McCarthy era, particularly when they're talking about the settler colony now known as the United States, or they talk about this current moment as being unprecedented. And instead you lay out a continuous and unbroken lineage of Red Scares that's intimately tied up with the fear of Black folks as a unique threat to the United States, right? So you and I both know that anti-Black racism particularly has never faded in any form. And Black folks have been the subject of continued violence by the state and interpersonally. Like, so based on what we were just talking about, what's your sense of why racism, at least on the surface, like folks, you know me enough to know I'm not saying, oh, somehow racism has gone away, or white folks think that, you know, they feel shy if they're racist. But at least on the surface, at some level, it's internalized, like racism, not good, right? And people tend or want to shy away from it. This is why we have a whole DEI industry of like white fragility and all this fucking shit, that like people try to back away from their racism, even when they are, while being an anti-communist maintained its public, unabashed character. Is this a displacement for anti-Blackness? Is it you just focus on being an anti-communist and therefore anti-Black there? What's your sense of that split, especially in the United States?
You know, I think that there's a way that you can, with racism, when you say like, this is not who we are, it has like there's a positive connotation to that, right? But when you say like, we are not communist, communism is not who we are, it's only negative. Like like foundationally, there is no way to accommodate communism in a capitalist society. And I write about in my book, it's probably one of the more theoretical things that I write about, you know, Blackness as like value minus worth. See, this is one of my critiques of like the Afro-pessimist thing, is that it's a fundamental contradiction. It's an aporia, is that it's value minus worth. Like this society, there's an aspect of the society that like is enamored with and loves and needs Black people, but then that is directly tied to like the hatred and fear and disdain and exploitation and violence against Black people. I don't think you can pull it apart at all, because of all sorts of things, like the you know, Black people raised white people for a very, very long time. They are integral to white people's lived realities and foundational to or white people's like prosperity. So like communism, not so. Like communists, not so. There's not that same contradiction. Even as there's radicalism that goes back to like not 1776, like that type of radicalism, but there's radicalism has been baked into this place, you know, militancy, but it's not accommodated, especially when it's specified through like communism, Bolshevism, anarchism, etc. It just cannot be accommodated. And this is, you know, and the US is relatively unique because it is like US imperialism ascended at a time in world history when there were two competing economic systems. And so the way that US political economy operates is like, it's not only that your thing is bad, it's that we cannot coexist, right? And that has not been the orientation to Black people. It's not that we cannot coexist, it's that we have to coexist through relations of subordination and domination, and maybe through affinity at some point. And so it's just a fundamentally different structural relationship that plays out in economic, political, social and interpersonal ways. So that would be how I would see that. At the same time, that not unlike racism, there's times when like the anti-communism waxes and wanes in terms of its intensity, and when it does fall out of vogue. So like at the Army McCarthy hearings of 1954, for example, Americans had kind of had it with that particular regime of anti-communism. They wanted a more liberal anti-communism. And this is the problem. The problem with the ways that anti-communism has been combated is that it was almost never, except by communists themselves and maybe some other radicals, it was never that people can think and believe whatever it is that they want. It was that, no, that thing is bad, but you're doing too much. You're lumping in people who aren't actually communists, right? You're creating this dragnet and this web that's actually looping in the good Americans, the good ideas, and so that I think is also true. But I don't know that, and we don't have a kind of endogenous Marxist tradition. It's been Americanism more than Marxism, so to speak, right? Again, for various reasons. And so I think it's just much easier to point to communism bad than it is to point in a sort of longue durée way to like Black bad, because there's just too much evidence right there in front of you that this is not the case.
Yeah, this is super helpful. And I think for the first time, like rereading your book, I was just like, oh, this is why I wanted to ask you this. So the sort of fundamental integration of Blackness, whether even through violence, like the sort of suturing of these things might make that difficult, and the conflicts that are involved in that, the value produced, stolen, extracted, all the things you're saying. But for the first time in rereading your book, I was at the part that I thought about is communism, anti-communism then also becomes a safe displace, a holding space. Like you can, because to your point, if it's Black scare, Red scare together, then Red scare is also anti-Black. And so you can express all your anti-Blackness under the guise of anti-communism and never have to say I'm anti-Black. You never have to actually say I don't like Black folks. But when you say I don't like communists, they're the ones that are evil, they're the ones ruining our country, they need to get out of here. There's, in psychoanalytic terms, the displacement and like the texture and the structure, you're speaking about Black folks too, which is to your point.
And part of and so when I write about Black people, like Black liberals trying to uncouple the Black scare and the Red scare, this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to say, no, that red thing actually is bad, but that's not who we are. Like, we believe this thing is bad too. And so we want to combat anti-Black racial oppression. We want to combat white supremacy through anti-communism by distancing ourselves from communists. And in fact, by conveying that, like, we would never be that. And this happens in a number of ways. It's through like ideas like African socialism. It's through ideas like, Black people have our own unique socialism that's not linked to Marxism. The idea that Marxism is some like white people shit or some European shit or whatever. So there's all kinds of ways that it's argued out from the left and the center and of course the right. But it is this fundamental misunderstanding that the Red Scare has always foundationally included this scepter of Black radicalism. And so you cannot pull them apart.
Right. For folks who haven't read your book, like what are you specifically pointing to when you're like, in the context of this settler colony, you can't pull these things apart. These are the things that we're looking at that are like, that's what tells us we can't pull them apart.
Well, for example, we just had this recent Cuba report, right? Cuba, the capital of 21st century communism. And it's not happenstance. There is an entire chapter on racial revolution, which is about Black people. I think they mentioned a few Puerto Ricans in there or something, but like it's about Black people. Yeah. It is about Black nationalists. So they lump in Marxism, nationalism, Pan-Africanism, whatever. They're just like, that Black shit was like Stokely Carmichael and SNCC, apparently, were the progenitors of that. But there's a whole chapter on Black people. And even in other chapters, you have people like Karen Bass and Barack Obama thrown in there, because with any anti-radicalism, there's always a suspicion about what the Blacks are doing.
Yeah.
If you take the student intifada, for example, it is not happenstance that the brutalization of those participating in the student encampments was directly accompanied by that attack on DEI. And all of a sudden, this rise in these plagiarism allegations, which, mind you, are 100% Black people, primarily Black women, because that became the entry point to point out, like, oh, see, when you let those Blacks in, all this other radical shit happens, right? All of this other, subversion and rabble rousing happens. We don't keep these things white. And so that is, those are kind of two examples.
Those are all absolutely. And I think it's why we kept hearing over and over again from right-wing discourse and all of that, which unfortunately we follow way too closely, but you have to fucking see what's happening. Is like, they would often point, especially in my field, but in other, they're reading Frantz Fanon. They're listening to Kwame Ture. They're looking and learning from the Black consciousness movement, and like this shit where I'm just like, yeah, the students were. There's a reason why they're doing that, because they were talking about anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, capitalism. They understood the function of the university within these larger places. But you're right. I think the go-to to be like, look at this. These are the people who are feeding and filling the minds, which ties in, of course, to the anti-CRT shit. Like, it's the same language and the same bullshit that gets repeated. But to our point is like, there's an interior and psychic and affective infrastructure that has been built over a very long time for that to land somewhere. It wouldn't land somewhere without the anti-Blackness.
Right. And, and this is why there's this like full court press to like drum up this anti-Palestinian sentiment among Black people, or at least to sort of overrepresent whatever handkerchief head critique some Black people might have of like the pro-Palestine solidarity movement. And also, the Black Arab tension, for example, in a place like Detroit, where, which is, around the El Sayed, for example, like people are pointing to the fact that Black people are the lowest demographic that voted for El Sayed here. And there are material reasons for that, but it's the outsized focus on Black people in particular in this issue. And also, trying to pay a particular subset off, precisely because it's such a strong Black people sort of organizing and solidarity is just such a strong driver in radical movements writ large.
That's right. That's right. I hadn't thought about it in this tinge. This goes into the next question I wanted to ask you. It's almost like they're saying, these white supremacists, like, look, even Black folks aren't, even those people we worry about as being the most radical are like not joining you. This must be really bad. I'm thinking unconsciously. White folks are just like, oh, because there's this tension, there's this fetishization, there's this tension always that happens through racism, where you're just like, oh, apart from also what you go through in your book is like being really American or not, which then brings into that entire question as well.
Yeah, and I think it's because it's a way to try to influence. I think on the one hand, it's a way to try to influence Black people away from people who don't read, who don't know anything about the political situation, to make it seem as if, oh, Black people aren't supporting this, so why should I, right? Yes. When in fact, a lot of Black people are supporting Palestine, either explicitly or implicitly. Yeah. And related to this, a few years back, there was all of these charges of anti-Semitism, and this is prior to October 7th. And so many claims about anti-Semitism are levied at Black people. So I don't know if you remember like Nick Cannon, Kyrie Irving.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something there too. There's a way that it's like, and you know, and we'll talk about this when I talk about This Is America, my This Is America project. But June Jordan, back in like 1990, when she wrote the speech, talked about how it's not enough that we give billions of dollars to Israel. We also have to have this unyielding fealty and pro Israel position, or you're a subversive. So there's something there. So I don't have a fully complete thought, but there's also something about the levying anti-Semitism at Black people that's related to trying to deter them away from pro-Palestine and to try to trick people into thinking that no Black people support Palestine, right?
That's right.
Which is just not the case.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. And through fear and through the unspoken or very directly spoken consequence of what happens when that's the case. And Maya Gelman has a great book about the ADL, the history of the ADL, as precisely along these lines. She was like, this has never been a pro-Jewish organization. It's been a white supremacist, America First organization from the beginning. And all of their coercive tactics towards Black folks, particularly when they mobilize, we were the ones who helped you. We're the ones who helped you, through Jim Crow, through all this sort of stuff. We're the ones who stood up. Where are you now? Right. Mm-hmm. Which is already this sort of coercive relationship that disavows white supremacy and racial hierarchy in the context of this settler colony and the settler colony now known as Israel, and disavows the fact that we know that the ADL has always spied on radical Black movements. I mean, Black folks in general, because that's the point, is to cast a wide net. Like, very rarely do these people, sometimes they know who quote unquote the radicals are, but if you suspect everybody as a sleeper cell potential radical in the making, you're going to cast a very wide net and say every Black person, every Arab might be ...
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it reminds me of, so I've been reading a lot of Babu, again, which I'll talk about later on, but like Abdulrahman Babu is like an East African Marxist, and he talks about the ways that the British were particularly targeting East African Pan-Africanism. The name eludes me, but there was like a East African, like Pan-African regional, kind of like the AES, but in East Africa. And they were particularly aggrieved by this because of the ways that it would link Pan-Africanism and Pan-Arabism. So there's also this long, this disdain for Black Arab solidarity, which is wholly political. I don't think that there's like there's not a natural or historical affinity. It's built about through anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. And I think that that's why there is such a effort at destabilizing that relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because again, and if we're thinking about it from an internationalist perspective, like what's worse than being like, oh shit, there's a lot in common here. And they find like, it's not about actually, this categorization of identity as white supremacy creates. It's actually, we are united through the logics of anti-imperialism, of anti-capitalism, of anti-racism, which is a harder beast. On this note, so this is the question I also had for you. Like, your work for me is about, when I say reclaiming disavowals, it's about taking precisely what you're saying, and there's a disavowal that comes with forgetting, where Black folks and how they have played into this historically, and in lieu of this sort of liberalization, right? This narrative that Sarah Ahmed talks about it as like making, diversity a nice word because racism's a bad word. And I feel like your work sort of rejects that and sort of brings it back, rehistoricizes, refocuses on us, which is for me part of militancy. I was reminded again, as I listen to you, as I read you, of this, what I feel, and these are my words, so please correct me if there's a better way to say this, but it's almost like dual racist myth that the US peddles about Black folks. So on the one hand, they're uniquely dangerous because they're radical and therefore enemies of the state. We know that version. And on the other hand, the veneer that Black folks are only conservative churchgoers who won't be involved in labor organizing, and these, like, they're almost like a surprise every time. So on the one hand, there's a unique threat. On the other hand, there's a surprise when folks figure out, oh, Black folks are actually pro-Palestine or organize, right? I'm thinking, of course, of Reverend D.G. Kelly's Hammer and Hoe here too, right? I heard him speak about it a couple of times, where like that was part of the organizing. Like, folks didn't think that Black folks would be joining in the labor organizing, particularly in the South. So this was very odd to me. I moved to the settler colony when I was 21. And so, having grown up in a politicized Lebanon, the only version of blackness I knew was the radical tradition, right? The Black Panther Party or anything, the sort of global South in general. So when I moved to the United States, I was really taken aback by this, for lack of a better word, a double stereotype, right? Because I realized both sides were mobilized to discipline Black folks. But what's your sense of when one side is animated versus the other? And if you don't see it that way, I'd love to know it as well.
Yeah, so it's funny, right? Like, thinking about this through the lens of anti-communism, both were used to paint why Black people need to be particularly surveilled. On the one hand, if you're uniquely susceptible to radicalism. So I talk about this when I talk about the outside agitator, for example.
Yeah.
The outside agitator is like an educated Black, uppity Negro who is susceptible to foreign ideas because they don't accept their station in life. On the other hand, you have the ignorant Negro who is that docile, probably traditionalist, conservative, like in church clapping and shit, who doesn't know any better. But then that makes them susceptible to the outside agitator or to foreign influence because they don't know shit. But if it were not for the rabble rousers coming in and riling up the Blacks, they're perfectly happy with their station in life. They love picking cotton. They like walking off the sidewalk when a white person walks by. They're fine with it, right? That's the Black way of life. And so I think that both of these, together they're a totalizing narrative that legitimates like Black surveillance. So you're either too docile and thus susceptible, or you're too radical and thus susceptible to challenging the state. And I will say, I have trafficked in both of these for different reasons. So one is like, at a certain point, I'm like, African Americans are like the vanguard of the revolution. We have kicked off every movement worth having in this country. We've been at the forefront. There's issues with that. On the other hand, I've had times where I'm like, Black African Americans are the most fucking backward. Like, we are like the fucking Obama shit. It's like, Black people are more American than Americans. They love this America shit and therefore are the most acculturated into this imperial project. So I have felt both ways as well. Neither of which are wholly correct. But what is true is that Black people are human beings. And so Black people have a range of ideological perspectives. They have a range of relationships to movement. They have a range of relationships to oppression and repression. You know, an analogy that I think about is like, if you grew up in an abusive household, some people become abusers. Some people would never think of abusing their spouse because they grew up with that. Some people are somewhere in the middle, right? Then there's the different responses to that, like fight, flight, fawn, whatever, right? And so likewise, I think people have all kinds of responses to radicalism. But in a general sense, right, Gerald Horne has talked about how, in a general sense, Black people tend to be more progressive in general than white people because they're not racist. Because right, they do not, in that baked in anti-racism, of course there's internalized racism in different ways that comes out through class and all this other shit, but like in a general sense, because Black people are not white supremacists, generally they're more progressive, right? And they historically have been more reticent, even if they weren't then join the Communist Party, they're more reticent to condemn communists because they're like, oh, they want economic, parity for all people. Sounds good to me. Oh, they don't have Jim Crow chapters. Oh, there's nothing wrong with that, right? And as we know, if a Black interracialism was one way that you would be gauged as a communist. How you had a Black person in your house? Did you have a Paul Robeson record? Do you believe in Black equality? These are questions that they asked in like the fish committees and HEWAC and shit to see if people were communists. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things that I'm like is screaming out to me as you say this is just like, yeah, in the eyes of the state, Blackness is the problem. It's not like what position, like you're either too, you know, you're impressionable because you're a churchgoer, you're impressionable because you're a radical. It's like, oh, what's the common denominator here? In the eyes of the state is Blackness, right, which is really the issue that you're bringing, that you're highlighting.
And you know, when the Afro pessimists talk about like fungibility, this is what they mean. It's everything and nothing, right? It's capacious enough to have every single narrative be accommodated, right? Like, but it's in the vein of dehumanization, because when a whole people are reduced to some archetype or stereotype, then you're not recognizing their humanity, right? They become this container for whatever external ideas one has.
Yeah. And possibilities for movement outside of that are necessarily or essentially foreclosed, right? And I think, but this is what the other thing I was thinking about is when you were saying, you know, they're part of the imperial project, or Black folks are more American than others. And I've thought to myself that they're disproportionately targeted as to be seduced into the imperial project through various channels, of course, channels that might exist already, but like precisely because quote unquote Blackness is the problem, there's a disproportionate target. I feel this is what I see as a non-American, right? Moving to this country at 21, having to learn the racial codes, doing the study to be like, what the fuck is in front of me and how can I understand this? And how do I take the ethical responsibility to understand my position as an Arab immigrant into this larger story? Because that also was like, oh, wait a second, there are ways in which immigrants, Arabness, all these sorts of things are always triangulated via Blackness, right? And sort of like in various ways, right? American first, all these sorts of things, immigrant, you know, more high achieving, the complexities, but in the end, the structure is anti-Blackness. And that's a piece I learned very quickly, but also started to notice all the ways in which that's disappeared or attempts to be disappeared. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I had the question in graduate school of, you know, is it white and non-white, or is it Black and not Black that is actually the structure? And I think it's both, like at the same time. We often think of like white and non-white. Of course, the Afro-pessimists think it's like Black and not Black. But I do think, and I think that both have their merit, but I do think that it is important to take seriously, perhaps not in an ontological way, but in a structural and a material and discursive and ideological way, how Black and not Black are also like structuring poles of the society, which just makes it incumbent upon other racialized people to be aware of that as well, right? That is something that we're acculturated into, and even other Black people, quite frankly, that is something that we're acculturated into. And so it's something that we need to pay attention to directly alongside like fighting white supremacy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I feel like, you know, if we're not doing, I mean, those are the seductions away from like the condition that creates all of this. So maybe this is a good way for us to get into your This Is America project, because it feels like we're talking about This Is America. For folks who don't know, Dr. CBS launched this project on Instagram called This Is America from, I think you were doing from June 4th to July 4th. You were sort of combating the propaganda around the 250th anniversary of America. And I can get into all this bullshit that I saw, and it was off the charts, you know, how hard the empire is working to stabilize itself. But you described it as highlighting and uplifting Pan-Africanist, communist, and radical Black perspectives, which I found they were fucking awesome. I especially loved how you truly decentered the imperial belly as the core of all knowledge production, which we talked about a little bit today. And you highlighted thinkers that are rarely mentioned, even among the radical left in the settler colony of the United States. Can you talk about how this approach, this decentering and recentering, ties into your work more broadly, and perhaps give listeners even a sense of who you talked about, like who you were your favorites in going through this? I waited for those reels every single day. I'm like, I want to see who's on the list today.
Yeah, of course. And so I did it to mark the, semi-quincentennial of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And much to my horror, I was saying sesquicentennial, and that is not the right word. It's semi-quincentennial. So I'm, that's the academic side of me, is mortified by that mistake. But anyway, so, because there's all kinds of shit that the U.S. likes to narrate about itself. And then, I have a write-up of This Is America Project coming out in Pen Is My Machete, which is like the magazine of Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective. But part of how I opened that piece was like, there was the America 250 project that actually got superseded by Trump's like Freedom 250. And I was like, so what, which is whatever. So basically they're pushing like this Christian shit, the bravery of Americans and, whatever, this particular narration of, the fighting, the American fighting spirit and all this other bullshit, highly corporate sponsored iteration of America. And it's like, well, that's one way to understand it. But there are a lot of people who have written about various aspects of the United States, either from the perspective that, the real Americans are the militant, radical, revolutionary people who actually are human-centered, or from the perspective of like, fuck that place, like, land back, So there's a whole range of ways that people were critiquing whatever the official narrative of the United States was, up to and including like, okay, well, just do what you said you were going to do. Let's just start there, right? Just do the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness thing. Let's just start there and see what happens, right? And reveal the contradictions that way. And so, I was interested in, so first of all, like doing kind of like a popular education project. So knowledge production by other means. I typically write stuff. I do a lot of podcasts too, but I don't do a lot of short form content because I'm deeply ambivalent about it. Like on the one hand, I think it's important because that's where especially younger people are. People cannot read, they have no critical thinking. And so the short form content becomes an important way to reach a particular demographic. On the other hand, it's like, I felt like I was perpetuating or reproducing that short attention span by breaking down what are, to me, very complex and very rich forms of thought into these 3-minute sound bites. And so I was working with a guy named Chris Alfonso. He's John Paul Fart on Instagram. And so he had to give me the game, like it has to be under 3 minutes and blah, blah, blah. And so he produced it. I just did the recording and he would go in and cut things down when it was too long and put in the graphics and all that stuff, because he's the one that even was like, you should make short form content. And I was like, I don't know about that. So, but it was a way to sort of, even for me to think differently in that regard. And then I wanted to lift up people that I admire and whose ideas I think are interesting. And I wanted to balance stuff I had already read with things that I wanted to read myself. So I don't read a lot of stuff outside of the 20th century. So there was a few people like, Ida B. Wells and Henry Harlan Garnett that I included who are from like the 19th century. And especially Henry Harlan Garnett, I was just like, he was with the shits. He was like, if you are enslaved, it is your Christian duty to resist. And you have to punish these white slaveholders or you are disrespecting yourself and God. And so he was saying this in a Christian way. I am not a Christian, but I was like, that shit was powerful. Even apparently it was so radical that Frederick Douglass was like, whoa, my nigga, like chill. He was like, you're doing too much, which is funny, which is also what Frederick Douglass said to John Brown, apparently, but whatever. So I picked out kind of 6 of my favorites or whatever, six people. First, so on day 2, I did William Patterson's Negro History Week, and that's because it has one of my favorite quotes of all time. My first favorite quote is by George Jackson, the settle your quarrels quote. But this one, he ends this piece with the line, "Such is the course of savages ruling in a modern exploitative society." And I just think that is fucking bars. But basically he's talking about, only these white barbarians would erase Black people's contribution to history. Like only the worst type of people do stuff like that, right? And so I thought that was an important piece. On day 6, I did Abdul Rahman Babu, who I mentioned earlier. He had this speech at the International Conference on Malcolm X that was given in 1990. And he talked about when the US is targeting communism, they're actually targeting the third world. And so he mentioned how, like, ostensibly they're going after the Russians, but they're actually going after Castro and North Korea and Gaddafi and et cetera. And so I thought that was extremely relevant to what is happening now. And also, like, I love Babu because I love Walter Rodney, who I also talked about in this project, but I first was introduced to him because he wrote the afterword to How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And so he's just somebody I've been reading a lot, and so who's important to me. Day 8 was Glenn Ford, R.I.P. to Glenn Ford. I think this year was the fifth anniversary of his passing, July. And so I included his piece, "Both Major U.S. Parties Are Plagues on Humanity," basically critiquing the duopoly. And I will say Glenn Ford is one of the few political people who fucking hated Obama from 2008 onward. He stood 10 toes down and he critiqued what he called the Black misleadership class because of their capitulation. Like, he was such a principled and just politically and analytically amazing. He was a little bit mean sometimes, which I also appreciate because, like I said, that is my disposition. But he was always kind and helpful to me, and I love Glenn Ford. On day 16, I did C.L.R. James's American Civilization, and that turned out to be the most popular one. In fact, just like last week, I turned the comments off because people were still commenting on it and all kind of shit. I just turned the comments off because I was tired of getting the notifications. But so that book, one of my great friends, Harvey Neptune, he's a Trinidadian scholar. He introduced me to that book, American Civilization, a long time ago. And so I had never really read it, but I went through and I skimmed it. And I found this quote that was basically about the Black bourgeoisie and co-optation and how basically, you add a few chips in the cookie and that allows for the most conservative policies to become legitimate among Black people. Kind of what we've been talking about earlier. Yep. 2 more. Day 29 was Gerald Horne's The Counter-Revolution of 1776. And in fact, that book was actually the inspiration for this project because Counter-Revolution of 1776 is a retelling of 1776 that even the white left fucking hated. They were like, how dare you, like the Trots in particular, right? So people really took exception with that book because as much as people hate this country, they believe in aspects of the narration of like the bourgeois revolution and this bullshit. And he was like,
they identify with it. Yeah,
100%. And especially, and this is one of his critiques of the Communist Party and why the Communist Party has no indigenous line, because a lot of them immigrated here. And so they believed in they benefited from the American dream in ways that Negroes were like, no, you know what I mean? That is
what
not
the fuck
case.
are you talking about?
Right. And so I had to include his was like the first one that I was like, I need to include this. And then finally, on day 30, I did June Jordan's Intifada USA because free Palestine, obviously free Lebanon. She was somebody who I turned to, and I want to shout out JT Rohn, who's a scholar at Rutgers, but he's writing about her now, but he kind of put me on to like her politics. A lot of people know her for her poetry, but she was writing this shit in the 90s. And in fact, recently, a couple of years ago, a piece came out by a woman named Marina something where she talked about how like Audre Lorde and Barbara Smith and them really turned their backs on June Jordan at a particular moment because she took a pro-Palestine stance and they aligned with their like Jewish feminist homegirls against her. And so I was like, I want to lift this up because now people are pro-Palestine and myself included. Like I haven't always been hip to, I was never anti, I just, but I was never like studying and super, learn it on the politics until I would say maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And so I wanted to lift up somebody who was on that shit when it wasn't cool, when people were like losing their jobs and their communities and their friends for it. And funny enough, it was on day 30, but it was supposed to be like day 3. But when I was talking to Chris, he was like, well, I sent it to him and I said, what do you think about this? And he was like, you know what? This will get shadow banned, and it will, whenever you do anything Palestine, it pushes everything down in the algorithm. So he was like, it's probably better to put it at the end of the project so that if it does get shadow banned, whatever comes after, it doesn't matter, right? And so I was like, I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do a little bit later. So this is the social media strategy bullshit, but I knew it would be in there. So those are some of my favorite things that I talked about. And, again, I just think it was a really important popular education project. There's a lot of stuff people can do with it, and that I'm still plan to do with it. It got me a lot of followers on Substack, which is good. Although, I'm ambivalent about the Substack. Everybody, like my friend Erica posted, like, now we could be coming together in the streets, but now everybody got a Substack. And I'm like, damn, that's true. Because I just got mine too. But anyway, yeah. So that was the This Is America project.
I loved it. But to your point, it's like, that's actually interesting because I did not see that last one. I had to go looking for it.
See, he was right.
And that's the thing, is like, because I was religiously following it and I was sharing them and I was like, okay. And I'm like, didn't see that. So I had to go to your actual account to see that one.
And what's funny is that I think that was the second most popular one, though. And I don't know if because so another thing that I'll mention is, like, I never really knew about collaborating on collaborating on posts until I spoke with Chris. And so that also helped things circulate. But I think with that, when I collaborated with like Mark Lamont Hill or something, which is why maybe eventually it got circulated in the algorithm. But and again, I felt ambivalent about that. I was like, am I being a fucking sellout because I'm waiting till the end? But it's like, but I thought it was equally important for all of these people to be lifted up. And so it's just so crazy. You didn't see I was just like, are you sure? And he's like, yeah, man. So there you go.
Tell me about it.
I mean,
check it out. Exactly. Yes, folks, check it out. Check out the whole project. I mean, it seems like it was I would see it and be like, folks are interacting with it. Folks are appreciating it. What are some of the, the good feedback you got to the point of why you did it to begin with, like along the lines of what you were hoping the mission of it was, what you were hoping to do? What's some of the feedback you got?
I got a lot of people saying, like, I'm learning a lot from this. Like, I can't wait for the next one, which is good. It was a lot being like 10 people, which is a lot. If it's 10 people who never heard of any of these people, that's something, right? I think that there was a lot of discourse. Now, I am somebody, I block people. People don't get to just come and talk shit on my page. It's me and Chris did a conversation about the project, and it's posted on my Substack. And I talked about this, like, he just lets people go and talk shit on his stuff. I don't play that shit. So I do block a lot of people. I will hide comments because that's crazy. But it did start, it started conversations like in the comments. Some people talked about, using it for like political education in their organizations. And so, he was the analytic person. I didn't look at the analytics or anything, but it seemed to me that, and then I was on the Tavis Smiley show. Tavis Smiley has like he has a radio show. And I think there was a couple of things that people are like, oh, I saw your This Is America project and wanted to have me come on and talk about whatever. So, and so in that regard, it was a good thing. And I feel like it, again, expose people to thinkers that they might not necessarily have heard of before. And then, the couple of people who asked me then to come speak on their shows, people may or may not have ever heard nobody talk about no communist shit. You know what I mean? And so, so that's good as well.
Yeah.
As they say, like, nothing's too good for the working class. So these ideas belong to us. And so however they can be circulated, like, I'm here for it.
I love that. Yes, exactly. And then finding ways to do that. And I think for me, there's always been this, the warnings that I've gotten from people, both peers and people older than me, are like, well, what if people don't join you? Or what if people don't understand what you're doing? Or like when I was doing psychic militancy, and people who I know are well-meaning, we know the difference between people who are well-meaning and who are not, would be like, why don't you use a word different than militancy? Because that will bring more people in. And I'm like, people are fucking thirsty for this shit. This is the moment for us not to bend away from that. This is the moment, particularly when we're seeing what's happening with Cuba and Palestine and Lebanon and Yemen and Iran. This is the moment for us to lean into this shit and be like, no, these ideas exist, like you're saying. Knowledge production doesn't come from the imperial core only. People have been talking about this shit for fucking ages, like June Jordan. There are all these ways in which these ideas, these archives, these communal spaces circulate, whether or not you're attuned to them. They circulate under your nose. And there's a thing about collating them and presenting them in that way. But that's also what I love about your work. You're never like, hey folks, I invented this shit. You're just like, check it out. This has been going on. Here are the ways that we can sort of mobilize and animate it for this current moment. But this shit's here. Like we've got a wealth of shit to tap into.
I'll say so it's funny. I was having a conversation with Brianna Joy Gray about tangential to this, where she was saying she wants democratic socialists to basically be more socialist, ones who are running for office to be kind of more socialist in their messaging. And she mentioned Al Sayed, and I was like, and I don't agree with that. I think we who actually have these politics should be emphatic and principled and steadfast in our politics. But if people are not with that shit, then you get people like AOC, people who ventriloquize the politics and then only to sort of get a particular position and then do an about face. Zorhan Mamdani, people are feeling however they feel about him. And it's like, we don't need people to popularize the term. We need people to be committed to this shit. Like, and so to the point of like, people who are telling us, to use this or that word to bring more people in. We saw that happen in 2020 where people cycle through organizations and cycle through movement because it's interesting or because they're like, yeah, but they're not really committed to it. And you get more people like that when people are touting, Joy James calls them neo-radicals, and people are like touting this message, but they're not really committed to it. And that to me does as much harm as good, because then people become disillusioned, right? So there's a lot of people who are heartbroken about AOC, a lot of people or Bernie or Zorhan who like fall out of movement because they only see it as an illusion. Or people who are saying socialism or whatever, even pro-Palestine, but like that's not what they mean. They mean some liberalism like dressed up in more radical language. And so I think that we do need to sort of democratize these ideas, but we have to gatekeep them to a certain extent because they're not for everybody, and because they're ours, and therefore the people we love and care about. They are not for people who are going to pimp this knowledge to reproduce some petty bourgeois orientation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Exactly. We got to protect our shit, and some people are going to be left behind. I think that's the thing people also struggle with,
100%.
Leaving folks behind. Is there anything else that we haven't touched on that feels important, that's kind of burning in your belly, that's like, Lara, fuck this shit, let's go here, or anything else you want to leave the listeners with?
Well, I'm just interested in like what has been like the reception of your book. You did it with Pluto.
Yes.
And so I imagine that, so you have your academic work. I haven't done I did the collective volume with Verso, but I haven't done my like trade press yet. But so what was that experience versus, not me interviewing you, but like, what was that experience versus doing your academic book? And like, how do you, like, is it being received in the way that you wanted to?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because you're interested. Exactly. No, you're on this show as a guest of mine, and I appreciate any questions. I'll start with Pluto. Pluto's awesome. Shout out to Pluto. Shout out to my editor, David Schulman. And I think Pluto is one of these spaces that does exactly what it means to do, sort of like you were just saying. It's like, don't pretend to be a radical press and then pull shit from people, which we have heard many quote unquote leftist radical presses pull stuff, especially about Palestine, that's unbending. And then Pluto took them, which tells you everything you need to know about Pluto. And I had that experience too. I mean, it was very expansive, and like no sort of disciplining out my voice and what I actually needed to say. And so like I make a political choice in this book to never refer to the Zionist entity by the name that it took for itself. And I do that, and I explain why I do that as a part of psychic militancy, to like undo and unlearn the ways in which we bend and compromise, even on these very what seem like small things, but they're not. And they were like, we get it, you know, like make the book you want to make. And I really think that's why it's landing with folks. So that I've been very grateful for the ways it's been received. You know, I've been able to do many book events. I get to do one in Aotearoa coming up. In LA, I have a couple. I did it in London. Like I got to do one in Beirut in my hometown.
Oh, wow.
You know?
Yes.
And the portability of it is what I was hoping for, because I think it speaks to a world and infrastructure that we're all being bombarded by through this psychological warfare that's also a long-term project. And I think it's because Pluto allowed me to do it like this that it's landing on people for the reasons we're saying. People want that. They don't want to water down diluted bullshit, both sides, you know, mealy-mouthed bullshit that they can find anywhere. They want to be like, if you're talking about psychic militancy, what is it like to hold the fucking line? What is it like to be an extremist, like Malcolm X said, and not be ashamed of it? And like, I wanted it to be a parallel process. I wanted the way that I wrote it and the way I talked about these things to match the fervor that like, I'm like, folks, we need to get motherfucking on this train. And we have to keep that energy up. And I think Pluto was central to making that happen. So I give them so much credit. And I'm very moved by people coming up to me and saying, I see myself in this. The example, I use a lot of examples from organizing, from patient work, from supervision, you know, textual reading, George Jackson, Mumia, Ghassan Kanafani, and just sort of, they're just like, I see myself in this. Like I was that person. I understand what this is. So that means the world to me. I'm like, I'm not here talking to specialists. I've done that shit. Clinicians, I've spoken to them. It's time to speak to the comrades.
Yeah. But what's interesting is that I was on a podcast and I was talking about, I've always been very critical of particularly the psychoanalytic turn, because it came about during the Cold War to like, you know, replace materialist analysis. And so like, I was like, I'm not reading that, you know, materialism. But I was telling them that this book sort of changed my orientation, because you're critiquing that very thing. But then it is important to think about the psychological and psychic aspects of this domination. And to me, I'm writing right now about ethics, the ethical dimensions, right? You have all of these kind of non-tangible, if you will, or the things that can fall out of a materialist analysis. It's important to bring them back in, because how we think about ourselves and each other and how we relate to one another actually is like the basis of organizing. And so I've been learning a lot from the book, and then going back to, you know, the books that you cite, going back to read them. Because I think I read Joel Koval or whatever, the idea, it's a black book that I have that he wrote. But anyways, you know, to think about to read more psychoanalytic work that's sort of in the tradition that you named, because I do think it's important. And it's also like a lacuna probably in my own thinking. So yeah,
for very real reasons. Thank you. That's high praise. It means the world to me from you. And like, but it's because psychoanalysis did that to itself, because it, as a hegemonic method and practice of creating the bourgeois modern individual, it needed to be that. It is a white supremacist logic that gets replicated. And so, but the whole point that I'm saying is like, there's always been an entire universe of folks in the global South that predates Freud. And then we have Fanon, who is like, he didn't bend away from this shit. He's just like, we're using this. Like you said, these ideas belong to us. Right. And that, I think that's part of it, is, you know, like seizing psychoanalysis for revolutionary ends and being like, you motherfuckers don't get to hold on to this. We see this shit. You use it. Psychological warfare is based on it. Why would I leave it to you? you know.
Mm-hmm. Have you read any? I'd be interested in your thoughts on Frances Cress Welsing. Have you read any Frances Cress
No,
Welsing?
no.
Okay, or Yorugu, which is a different one, Maureen Baani. But Frances Cress Welsing is interesting. She's like the Afrocentric psychoanalytic. There's some out there stuff in there, which is why it's like I would love for a psychoanalytic person to read it and see what they think. But anyway,
I've got to get to it then. Now, if it comes from
well,
you, I will read it
well,
and
no,
we'll have a
do not take
conversation.
it as an endorsement. Just take it as something that's peculiar.
I got you. There's always going to be. That's how I read shit anyway. So
Yeah.
Love it. Yeah. No, there's something to be said about how the psychoanalysts have embraced Afro-pessimism in a way that's really telling. So I think I'm on the page of you and Robin D.G. Kelley in the way that you think against that. But it tells me something. It tells me something about the comfort.
Yeah, it does. And also, we have to think about why it resonates so much and what is the work that we have to do to win people over to a militant, a psychic militancy that's rooted in materialism and solidarity. So, that's the work.
I love it. This is a beautiful place to end. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And
of course.
All right, folks, until next time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was awesome.